Hello and welcome to IC 83, Development of a Seating and Mobility Index. I'm Patricia Karg and the moderator for this session. You can put comments and questions in the chat as the presenters go along. Most likely those will be addressed at the end of the session. At the end, I will also put the CEU code in the chat and announce it at the end of the session. You'll be muted during most of the presentation. So again, use the chat feature with questions. So now I'll hand it over to Julie to introduce yourself and your team.
Thank you, Patricia. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for hanging in there and joining us at the end of the second full day of the conference. I'm Julie Mannlein, a PT, ATP. I work for the University of Michigan. I've been there for 26 years, and I've been playing with wheelchairs for most of those years. Today, we will be discussing our development of the Seating and Mobility Index, which we are proposing will be a unified and validated method for clinicians to assess and quantify a person's need for different types and levels of complex rehab technology, which is based on function, participation, and environmental factors rather than diagnosis alone. This study is part of a group of studies on disability and rehab research for healthcare policy managed through the University of Pittsburgh Department of Rehab Science and Technology. This collaborative research involves 4 interrelated project activities designed to, number 1, evaluate current policy and novel models, both within the United States and outside the United States, and gather stakeholder input. Number 2, develop a standardized assessment tool for equitable CRT procurement, which is the SMI that we'll talk about today. Number 3, perform analysis of existing data sets and registries relevant to CRT. And 4, evaluate the feasibility of a new CRT policy model. Today I will be presenting with Melissa Wright. However, we would like to also acknowledge our collaborative team efforts with Rachel Hibbs from the University of Pittsburgh and Dr. Gianna Rodriguez from the University of Michigan. Our agenda this afternoon is to discuss the current limitations of CRT evaluation methods and documentation as it relates to current coverage policies, introduce the steps of developing the Seating and Mobility Index, and provide details on our tool assessment process, discuss our current status in the process of development and some limitations, and we will offer participation opportunities for stakeholders on how you can get involved. After this session, we hope you leave with a better understanding of the limitations of current policy, be familiar with the steps involved in developing the Seating and Mobility Index, and be inspired to get involved. This sub-project is part of a larger NIDLR disability and rehabilitation research project for assessment and investigation of new coverage policies for complex rehabilitation technology within a contemporary accountable care environment. The research team is led by Mark Schmaler at University of Pittsburgh and is a collaborative effort between the Ohio State University, University of Michigan, and University of Pittsburgh. The overall goal of this project is to propose an equitable and evidence-based policy for the coverage and procurement of complex rehab technology. This project is one in a series of 4 projects. We are currently in the second year of the 5-year grant. The goal at the end of the 5 years is to have a model plan that has been tested and can be implemented. So why are we doing this? This proposal was written in response to the voices of people with disabilities and providers of assistive technology who were surveyed and cited the funding and procurement process as the most significant barrier in matching a person with appropriate AT. Modern healthcare is moving towards accountable and value-based care that uses a combination of research, large data, and best practices to determine what services will be paid for. This study presents an opportunity for people who use CRT to seek a more equitable coverage policy. The reason we need change now is that in the United States, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, CMS, is the largest payer for CRT. For people with disabilities, this equipment is critical in meeting health and functional needs in order to fully participate in society. This includes the ability to seek education and employment opportunities. Current CMS coverage policies for CRT, which by the way are also adopted by most other healthcare insurance companies, are complex and restrictive in order to address concerns of waste, fraud, and abuse, more so than to provide people with disabilities an opportunity to meet their functional and participation needs. Waste, fraud, and abuse was an issue many years ago with certain unethical providers who have since been prosecuted or moved on. Qualification for this complex equipment is solely based off HCPCS codes or ICD-10 diagnostic codes. CMS fails to consider objective measures of functional mobility, complex medical needs, or other comorbidities. A diagnosis-based policy leaves no means for functional criteria to qualify a person for appropriate and necessary CRT. While an individual may present with medical and functional needs similar to that seen with one of the diagnoses listed on the coverage policy, they are given a lower level, less appropriate alternative simply because they do not have the listed diagnosis. Diagnosis does have to play a role, but you have to look at other factors as well to ensure equitable access to necessary equipment and services. Furthermore, coverage policies within the Medicare program were designed and are primarily targeted at the typical Medicare beneficiary, individuals over age 65 and primarily with chronic disease. Most notable of these restrictive policies is that any CRT device or feature that is needed to leave the home to participate in the community is explicitly not covered. This is known as a within the home restriction and conflicts with the spirit of the Rehabilitation Act. For example, a stronger motor on a power wheelchair to get around a school campus in a timely manner, or having a transportation anchor point to safely ride on a bus or in a vehicle is simply not covered. Thus, many people are forced to use less than optimal and often dangerous equipment to meet their needs in the community. Likewise, manufacturers are not motivated to invest in the research and development of higher quality equipment. Suppliers cannot offer higher quality equipment due to lack of reimbursement, and clinicians are simply overwhelmed with the time required to advocate for better equipment. Within the current policy, an individual has to have a qualifying diagnosis in order to obtain a specific piece of equipment, which is very complicated and restrictive. In addition to having the right diagnosis, there needs to be policy-specific documentation by the evaluating therapist in order to obtain seating components or accessories. Therefore, a person with a severe disability, such as advanced rheumatoid arthritis, multiple comorbidities, or polytrauma, without an underlying neuromuscular diagnosis, is limited to getting lesser equipment, even though their functional presentation is similar to someone with a neuromuscular condition. This further compromises their health and ability to access appropriate equipment and opportunities for full community participation. The same is the case for skin protection wheelchair cushions. A person with a disability must either already have a pressure sore or an approved ICD-10 diagnosis to qualify for such a cushion. Pressure sores are a known problem for wheelchair users and do impact health and the ability to participate in the community, not to mention the millions of healthcare dollars spent on treatment of these every year. Although the specialty evaluations typically provide multiple measures of function, there are no currently accepted standardized measures to facilitate an objective review, approval, and payer coverage for the provision of CRT. In addition, there is limited payer recognition and understanding of the objective tools that clinicians use for assessing the need for the customized equipment. Clinic to clinic, there is no standardization of evaluation methods or documentation processes, which then increases complexity for the reviewers and adds to the confusion, resulting in denials. Because of the current diagnosis-based criteria for qualification, more advanced power wheelchairs with seat functions such as tilt and recline are only covered for those who have a neuromuscular condition. Therefore, a client with diabetic polyneuropathy, for example, with lower extremity vascular insufficiency, stasis wounds, renal failure, maybe on hemodialysis, lower extremity weakness, impaired sensation, and coronary artery disease, who is definitely at high risk for falls and amputation, would not be eligible for power mobility without having a qualifying diagnosis, despite being unable to ambulate safely or propel a manual wheelchair independently due to claudication, dyspnea, fatigue, pain, etc. Similarly, a client with hereditary ataxia who has therapist and physician clinical documentation of impaired balance, decreased lower extremity sensation, frequent falls, and ataxia making gait unsafe for household mobility and ADLs may also be denied power mobility because the payer sees the client has 5 out of 5 upper extremity strength on exam and states the client does not meet criteria for a power mobility device, although they cannot safely and efficiently propel a manual wheelchair due to their ataxia and poor motor control. What we are hoping is that a standardized tool, such as the Seating and Mobility Index, would provide clearer documentation for the payers to bridge the gap and help them understand the medical need and justification for complex rehab technology. What happens when we get a denial? Well, lots of things. A denial will ultimately extend the overall timeline from the evaluation to delivery, which, as we know, is already a very lengthy process. This may require the client to have a repeat visit with their physician, the therapist, or supplier, adding increased time and healthcare costs. Time is spent by the clinicians updating their documentation, and support staff will also have additional work such as reviewing and updating all paperwork and resubmitting for funding authorization. The client may also move. They may change insurance or be placed in a long-term care facility, which then extends the process, further complicates things, or may not allow you to deliver the equipment altogether. Finally, there could be medical changes that take place during this interim, such as growth, weight gain, weight loss, progression of disease, functional decline, and high-risk individuals have morbidity and mortality. The objective of this phase of the study is to develop the Seating and Mobility Index, the SMI, for clinicians to quantify the need for different types of CRT, facilitate the use of objective measures that the clinician will select to qualify for CRT, not based purely on diagnosis, and ultimately improve the procurement process by developing an assessment tool that is based on function, participation, and environmental factors, rather than the current diagnosis-based criteria. We want to propose policy coverage that's based on the individual themselves and considers objective measures, including where people need to go and what they need to do in their everyday lives. I'd like to just restate something that Jean said this morning in the large data panel discussion. We need to stop letting policy influence our practice and start letting our practice influence policy. Now I will pass it on to Melissa, who will talk about the details of the steps involved in the development of the Seating and Mobility Index.
Thank you, Julie. Give me a minute here. Okay, that was a great overview as to how we got to where we are today. And I just want to say we're very fortunate to have an amazing team of clinicians, researchers, and all the educators, including students and stakeholders, led by the experts at the Department of Rehab Science and Technology from UPitt. This group has just been amazing to collaborate with. They've provided lots of expertise on their rehabilitation instrument development, data collection, analysis, which we are looking forward to doing, and really influenced our development of the SMI tool. In full disclosure, I just wanted to say I'm currently employed with Permobile, but I feel like this is very strong research and policy-based practice, and this is not product specific. So before we could create our SMI tool, our teams identified our overarching research question, which Julie somewhat mentioned, but to get into the research part of it, really our overview is to determine what are the current standardized clinical tools out in the literature today, as it relates to those ICF domains of body structures and function, activity and participation, environment, or personal factors. So our research aims in detail were to systematically review and evaluate the existing classification systems used in healthcare as it relates to the areas of comprehensively describes a person's functional status. Then we wanted to gather and assess existing standardized and validated tools, which we will discuss today, used to assess body structures and function, activity participation, and all the other ICF domains, so that we could create a CRT classification index. To use the ICF framework, which we will discuss throughout, in aims 1 and 2 to systematically develop this SMI tool. And I'll discuss how we went about that process. But most importantly, that process is to inform intervention based on user need, and also to perform initial clinometric assessment of the SMI, including content validity and iterator reliability. In the end, we will also correlate the SMI scores with levels of CRT interventions. So as I've mentioned, the core of our instrument development process revolved around the ICF domains. We took what we knew about all the limitations of the current seating and mobility evaluations, documentation, funding that we all love to do, and aimed to develop a tool that would allow our clinicians to assess and quantify a person's need for seating and mobility, not based on diagnosis alone. The tool development process was outlined in advance and involved several steps, which I will try to define here and describe in further detail in subsequent slides. First, our team conducted a systematic review to evaluate the existing classification systems and tools in healthcare as it relates to our CRT assessment. Next, we had to take those tools and identify what properties it specifically measured, what type of assessment, other clinometrics specific to the tools and seating mobility. Next, we had to have CRT experts help us with further review of the tools for validity, clinical relevance, and other properties to complete our final list. We also have developed an anonymous clinical survey to assess the current use and views of outcome measures and tools. This, we hope, will be going live soon. After completing data analysis of the clinical survey, we will create the seating and mobility toolbox with multiple tools and categories for clinicians to use as an objective measure. Lastly, we will create a detailed training material and conduct beta testing of our SMI tool. The first step in our SMI development process was to conduct a systematic review, which is defined as a review of the evidence on a clearly formulated question, using systematic and explicit methods to identify, select, and critically appraise relevant primary research, and to extract and analyze data from the studies that we included in the review. That's a mouthful, right? And it's a job, let me tell you. But we utilize this method because we wanted to provide a very complete summary of all the seating and mobility tools that actually exist in the literature. For any researchers out there, you understand this rigorous process, but it's very important because the quality of our review was necessary in order for us to proceed and develop this tool. After establishing our research question, which we clearly outlined to guide our protocol, to complete the details of the review, we use this PRISMA protocol, or something similar to the PRISMA protocol, which is well defined in the literature by Maher, to guide our process. So driven by our research question, as I said, first step was that we needed to clearly identify what were the inclusion and exclusion criteria so that we could then load these criteria into our covenanced web-based platform we use to search the literature. We created all of our search terms that included key elements of functional, objective, and subjective clinical assessments to discover what those existing tools, outcome measures, home environmental assessments that were in the literature. Some examples, this is not all inclusive, but some examples were, quality of life, wheeled mobility, manual wheelchair, postural assessment, skin integrity, etc. We did exclude, and we had to identify that we excluded studies that involved therapeutic intervention, education and training, pediatric populations, product development, or articles prior to 1995. We completed the key elements of the systematic review, as I said, in the covenants to search for existing tools in the literature related to CRT eval. This maintained that our process had limited bias and was standardized. After searching our criteria and covenants, we had 734 abstracts for relevance to our ICF domains. A minimum of 2 reviewers were required to screen these abstracts to make sure they met our inclusion criteria and were relevant to our CRT population. With further full text reviews of 205 articles, we then excluded 86 articles. Either poor study design, we identified the reasons, poor study design, intervention, irrelevance of the measure, wrong indication, wrong outcome, or weren't applicable to seating and mobility assessment. Then a reviewer completed a full text review and presented the details to our team of 5 for their concurrence. And many of us had to go back over those articles several times. If there was any conflicts, then the tool was then included for further assessment by our clinical expert team, leaving us with 119 tools. So further assessment, we looked at these tool properties. For only those articles, though, that were peer-reviewed, standardized in the literature, and involved your seating and mobility populations. We also looked at the scope and design to make sure that it was aligning with ICF, but we further reviewed that and had our CRT experts also review that. The tools were sorted and based on their seating mobility population. So for example, if a study was relevant and standardized with a specific population, such as stroke, spinal cord injury, or other conditions, it was clearly documented what conditions it was standardized within. And then some tools we found were luckily standardized to a variety of neurodiagnosis, which obviously is going to help us when building our toolbox and using it in a clinical setting. In this phase, obviously, we continued to come back to our ICF domains along the way and categorized what domains was the tool was measuring. More specifically, we looked at what the tool measured in this area, in this step of the study. Was it balance, ADL function, upper extremity function, etc.? a whole plethora of tools, which I'll show next on the next slide. What type of assessment was it? Was it clinician-based? Was it self-report? What type of scale did they use? What time did it take to complete the assessment? And believe me, it was anywhere from 5 minutes up to 75 minutes. Whether or not that's feasible, that is to be determined. We looked at the equipment and the space was needed, if certification or fees were required to use the test, and then also what specific information was available on the tool. We really needed this so that in the future, if we chose that tool for the SMI, we would have that information for subsequent training and education modules. So we categorized all these tools amongst the ICF domains. Now, I'm not listing the tools here specifically on purpose because our survey has not come out yet, but you will see it soon. But there was obvious overlap in some areas of what the tools measured when you look at our ICF domains. For example, some self-report functional mobility scales in the home also addressed satisfaction or quality of life. So they would technically follow more than one category. But we found standardized tools in each of these areas and tried to prioritize those. On an expanded CRT, we had experts on CRT then further review each tool. This kind of helped us to streamline as we were left with still quite a few tools, as I mentioned, and further justify the need. So we looked at went back to our advisory board, our other researchers and clinical groups, which totaled up to 20 people. And also they helped us to provide some feedback on our list. And some of our researchers also looking at, are these tools really validated in this assessment tools that are appropriate for our seating mobility population? Are they going to have clinical implications to specifically justify the need for seating and mobility wheeled mobility equipment? Do they have strong methodology, reliability, and validity? The final list is 41 tools, which then is what led us to our survey. So we are in the process right now. We have our survey instrument built, and it's in IRB approval phase, as I understand it. And this will be an anonymous survey of clinicians who will then rate the tools based on the degree of current use, relevance, and meaningfulness and burden. So tools will be rated on their degree of usefulness, meaning how often it's administered in practice, how meaningful it is, an extent to justify the intervention for CRT. Is it a burden to the administrator or the client to conduct the tool? And really, is there time, space, equipment, and training required, which kind of gives us another level of how burdensome this tool is. After completing the surveys, we will then analyze the data and summarize the results. Obviously, we haven't completed this step yet, so I'm not able to report any further, but we can kind of give you an overview of what we're thinking. As with previous steps in our process, we will obtain feedback and collaborate with our larger DRIP team for this step of the process before creating our final SMI toolbox. Our basic kind of expectation is, though, that a tool will be included if the majority of raters will select the tool as essential, useful, and no more than minimal burden. Obviously, that criteria will be determined. But our goal here, obviously, is to have this highly rated tool by clinicians so that we can index it and form a composite seating and mobility score. And so that using that own tool subscore and clinometric properties. Okay, let me give you a little visual. Hopefully this isn't too confusing of what we're kind of picturing in our minds. This is just a tentative workflow for the SMI that is kind of limited in domains for the purposes of presentation, but our final SMI tool will obviously include many more areas for a comprehensive assessment. But what we're looking at and what we anticipate is that our toolbox workflow will start with the clinicians selecting an appropriate test. So they will choose, let's say, from tool A, B, C, or D within each domain, depending on the client's presentation. We don't expect that a tool be selected purely based on the diagnosis. Rather, we expect the clinician's preliminary exam will drive the use of the appropriate tool based on the client's functional level. One example would be our client that Julie presented with diabetic polyneuropathy and other comorbidities, who presented with falls, dyspnea, fatigue, pain. I forgot all the other ones, the claudication I think you had on there. But clearly the tools selected by the clinician for that client will differ from the tools that may be selected for a client, let's say, that has C6 complete spinal cord injury functional level. So for the mobility domain, let's just kind of play this out. Let's say the tug test tool let's say A is the tug test tool, and it is selected for our client who can ambulate. And tool B, for example, would be selected for our client who primarily uses a manual wheelchair for mobility, and that would be a 10-meter push test, which would fall in a similar category of mobility. Let's say this therapist selects, and again, this is hypothetical, a subscore for upper limb function of 3, a coordination subscore of 5, cardiopulmonary function of 1, balance is 2, mobility is 3. We're going to look at these validated tools, use their validated subscores, as well as some other domains, obviously not depicted here, to contribute to our overall seating and mobility index. Now, we don't have the details of this all figured out yet, but this is kind of what we're thinking in our workflow in our mind. After developing the preliminary toolbox, we then will create very detailed training materials on how to administer and score the SMI tool. This will include how to make the tool selections and all the SMI subscores as we will further outline. In beta testing version 1, we'll test for content validity. This means that we'll have approximately 20 to 25 clinicians rate the clarity, meaningfulness, and practicality of administering the tool. This beta testing will be shared with the advisory group and all stakeholders for feedback before it is shared with outside clinicians. This feedback will then be used to update the SMI as needed to create beta testing version 2, where we will have clinical experts assess for inter-rater reliability. Obviously, full data analysis will be conducted on the validity and inter-rater reliability before we complete the final SMI tool. So our SMI tool works in tandem, obviously, with the other phases of the study that Julie described. And if you were in the R1 presentation just prior to this, we really work closely together, having this collaborative team to build our accountable care environment. We estimate that the value of such a tool is huge, really. It ultimately will have the potential to influence the clinical decisions for recommendations for CRT, and hopefully it'll help kind of unify that documentation to allow clinicians and payers to speak a similar language, or more similar anyways than what we currently have to deal with. We hope that the development of the unified and systematic tool for assessment may contribute to more equitable coverage for the individual who currently relies on rehab technology for their everyday lives. So we did have some limitations, and I'm sure we will encounter more, but we obviously had to ensure that we followed a very systematic methodology to build a validated clinical index, which is somewhat of a tedious process if you've ever done it. But there were other studies, some unfortunately that had we felt clinically valuable information, but we did have to eliminate due to study design properties or the fact that they were not applicable to our population. We also had some standardized and objective tools, more so in body structures and function, as we would expect, than we did in some areas like quality of life measures, cardiopulmonary function, strength measures, and specifically tone. But as we kind of progress along our development practice, we expect to really clarify what that beta testing will be. And I think we'll be able to, reflect on some of the things that we've done and why they were so important. We also know that larger scale testing, obviously, of the SMI will be needed, but this is just a first step along the way to give us more information and lead us towards an accountable change in policy for CRT. So where are we in the process? Next steps. Our clinical survey link will be available soon for those that are interested in participating. And we hope that you can provide us valuable feedback on our seating mobility tools when it is available. After completing our clinical survey and conducting data analysis, we will get valuable, necessary feedback, obviously. The clinical survey step is so important. So we hope that we also can use a small group of clinicians, or we may be able to use a small group of clinicians in our first phase of beta testing. So please email us if you're interested, or you can look for us on our look for more information on our website, crtpolicy.pitt.edu. So in addition to that, we want to encourage you all to get involved. You can do that by accessing policy websites in your areas or look for them on our website. You will also find a list of valuable resources and consumer advocacy groups there. And our study will provide this tool and this tool for seating mobility assessment really is the only value of it, and those are for those people that institute the real change is policy, is the people that work endlessly to advocate for that change. So please try to join those consumer groups and advocate for our end users. Also, if you want to get involved today, if you haven't seen it, and I know it was presented a few times and it's on our policy website, but you can go to that website on our CRT wheelchair policy survey and take about 10 minutes to complete that survey regarding, it just would provide great valuable information. And I know some of that was presented in the study just prior, but I believe that survey is still open until the end of ISS, maybe after. I'll let the rest of the team say how long that is. And we would like to thank all of our stakeholders in the industry. These are also on our website, but we really couldn't do this without our partners who have really provided feedback and support for our success. And lastly, I just would like to take the time to acknowledge our lead investigator, Mark Schmeller, and our entire collaborative team from UPitt, OSU, and Michigan. We really also sincerely appreciate the support of the department and rehabilitation research programs on healthcare policy and disability. Thank you so much for participating in this session, and feel free to reach out to us at the email on this slide, and we will now open the floor to questions.
Great, thanks, Melissa. I will just add that, so to clarify, there are two surveys. And the one that is open is the one that is the policy survey, and that one's available now through the end of February. And then we anticipate this one should open in the next few weeks and will be available for a few months. So you can look for that on the policy website that was on the slide, and I can put it in the chat as well. To answer the first question, Lauren, we are not doing it in pediatric measures right now, just to tackle one thing at a time. So we're just doing adults first, but obviously know there's a pretty big impact for the pediatric population. So this is just step one. We did exclude pediatric measures just because there are so many, as you saw in the slides with the number of tools that we were looking at, or assessment measures we were looking at, that it was just a way too huge of a number, and the diversity of the different types of measures was just too great to try to include all of them in one sort of toolbox. What is our proposed timeline? So as with any study, it's sort of gray depending on how things go as we go through. So the survey should be out soon in the next few weeks. And then we would build a toolbox through beginning to mid this year. So maybe second quarter or so. Again, those are all sort of flexible, but that's, we'll be working on building like the outline for this as we're doing the survey, because we can build the sort of structure and then fill in with the actual tools when the survey is completed. And I'll just add that we didn't include all of the details of every single step because this is just an overview, but I got a separate question that was, are we including clients? And yes, we have client stakeholders, and we anticipate to get feedback from client groups or consumer groups about what is an appropriate amount of time and different types of assessments that would be sort of acceptable to consumers to do during an assessment process.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think there was another question about when we expect to be beta testing. Obviously, we have to follow a systematic method and do the survey and analysis first. So I assume that would be second quarter sometime, maybe.
Yeah, I would say
second or third quarter.
Somewhere in there, yes. Great. Again, if there are other questions, you can, I will put the email and website in the chat. So client preference is in some of the tools that we were asking. So this is, I like to clarify the difference between an objective measure and an outcome measure. So we're not doing outcome measures per se in this, although some of them are outcome measures, but we're not using them that way. But things like the FMA or other sort of client specific tools that would give indications of client preference could be part of it. I can't say one way or the other which tools specifically, but there are a whole batch of tools that ask about client preference in addition to like satisfaction and other things like that as one of the domains that we would be considering. Okay. Just getting the email address. I had it pulled up and lost it.
Oh, the code. Are you looking for that?
No, that's the website that you can find more information.
Oh, it's crtpolicy@pitt.edu. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And there, yeah, there's the email. If you would like to participate or want more information, and again, sort of keep an eye on that CRT policy website, you can access the current survey that's out about policy right now. And then when the SMI survey is available, it will also be linked on that website. If there are no other questions right now, I guess you can turn it back to Trisha. And then again, feel free to reach out as questions might come up.
Great. So thanks everyone for attending. Thank you for the presenters. We look forward to seeing more of this work. And the CEU code is in the chat, and it is AQPFLO. AQPFLO. And I guess there's no more questions. Thank you again. Everybody have a good evening.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.